Okay, live.
We begin, David? Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We'll just do a couple of housekeeping announcements before the event starts. Thank you to everybody who's joining us. For this webinar, we will have French, Spanish, and Russian interpretation. For those that have registered for this webinar, you are joining via Zoom link. So you can find the interpretation button via Zoom at the bottom of the screen. If you are joining via the live stream on YouTube, then the interpretation is not available. You'll just be seeing the original streaming. This webinar will be recorded and different language versions will be made available on demand after the event. They'll serve as a valuable resource now and also in the years to come as part of the training. And they'll also be added to the LCIPP web portal once it's launched. So all the speakers will be keeping their cameras on throughout the event so that you can all see them. And so will the co-facilitators, Tom and Daly. Due to the new security features of this webinar, we just want to point out that if any participant would like to make a comment or ask a question of the trainers, then please use the Q&A function, and our co-facilitators will be monitoring the questions and reading them out as necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Good day to everyone, in particular our presenters and all of you who have registered for the event and are joining us as participants for this third in a series of 4 webinars. My name is Daly Sambo-Duro. I'm an Inuk from Alaska. I'm presently the International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, an Indigenous peoples organization with members in Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. I'm speaking to you from Anchorage, Alaska, where I'm presently living and working on behalf of the organization. I'm also the Arctic region member of the facilitative working group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, the newest constituted body of the UNFCCC. So welcome to the webinar today, and allow me to pass the virtual microphone off to my co-lead, Tom Cameron.
Hey everybody, thanks very much, Daly. My name is Thomas Cameron. I am with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I'm also here in my capacity as the Western Europe and Others Group party representative. And looking forward to today's discussion, and we've had a couple great webinars and looking forward to building on that. So thank you to all our speakers for joining us, and with that I'll pass it back to you, Daly, to give a brief recap of the last 2 webinars.
As I mentioned in my brief introduction, this is the 3rd webinar in a series of 4 webinars. And we got off to a bit of a rusty start, but I think by the time we're done, we should be fairly capable in the delivery of these webinars. The webinars are associated with activity 4 of the facilitative working group, which emphasizes knowledge and Indigenous knowledge, and also more specifically Indigenous knowledge related to climate change. The first webinar was entitled Trust and Respect, Contours of Indigenous Knowledge. And in that regard, we had an opportunity to hear from 3 speakers, Masai Naomi Kapuri, who spoke about Indigenous knowledge as adaptive, intergenerational, dynamic, and not static, and that it has developed over millennia, that Indigenous knowledge is intimately tied to the environment, and that it's important for Indigenous peoples to maintain both. We also had a speaker, Yi Min, from Myanmar, who spoke about the recognition of Indigenous peoples and how that is directly related to the recognition of Indigenous knowledge. We were also fortunate to have Victoria Bushman, an Inuk presently living in Greenland, but originally from Alaska, that spoke about the vitality of Indigenous knowledge, the strength of Indigenous knowledge, and that for scientists, or Western scientists maybe more accurately, that their institutions come and go, that they come and go, but that Indigenous knowledge remains constant within our communities, largely because of the intergenerational nature that Indigenous knowledge is collective. She gave some good examples of how Indigenous knowledge is tied directly to collectivities or Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples, rather than individuals. The second webinar focused on what does ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate change look like. And in that second webinar, we had an opportunity to hear from a Diné person, Dwayne Chiliyazi, who spoke about the crucial relationship of Indigenous peoples to Mother Earth and how our fate is tied to the fate of the environment, the fate of Mother Earth. Atencio Lopez, a Cuna Yala Indian from Panama, spoke of traditional medicine and Indigenous knowledge and the need to safeguard the rights of Indigenous peoples to such traditional medicine, and pointed to the important international human rights instruments such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ILO Convention number 169, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in order to shore up the objectives to gain respect for and recognition of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. We also were fortunate to have been joined by Slava Shadrin from Yakutia in the Russian Federation, who gave a very strong message about the fact that Indigenous peoples are not objects of research, but we're objects and subjects of research, and indeed objects and subjects of international law, and that there is a need to engage ethical principles that are directly tied to our right to free, prior, and informed consent. He highlighted the need for mutual respect and that it is key, and that there's a need to remove the inequities that exist in relation to Indigenous knowledge. Again, Victoria Bushman, an Inuk from Alaska, spoke about the work of the Inuit Circumpolar Council in the development of ethical, equitable, fair, and just engagement of Indigenous knowledge, and ways and means to identify Indigenous knowledge holders, as well as Indigenous peoples' governance mechanisms and structures. And indeed, she provided a number of different examples and the plain and simple message that we know what is unethical when we encounter it. So that provides a quick summary of the webinars number 1 and number 2. And for purposes of kind of framing the run of show or the program for today, I'll hand it off to you, Tom.
Thank you, Daly, for that summary. So today's objective is to take that more foundational understanding that we built in webinars 1 and 2 that Daly just described, and begin to complement it with some more concrete examples of how Indigenous knowledge can be utilized as part of knowledge synthesis and co-production. So our speakers today are going to aim to provide you with examples of what successful examples of knowledge synthesis and co-production look like, some of the challenges and fault lines encountered in this space, and ultimately try to provide you with some tools and best practices for engaging Indigenous knowledge in co-production and knowledge synthesis in a way that is ethical, equitable, and grounded in respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. So to achieve this, our webinar, once again, is going to be broken up into 2 parts. So the first part will be the training from our experts and speakers. And we're pleased to be joined today by 3 speakers from Australia, North America, and the Arctic, who Daly will be introducing shortly. We'll also have a 4th expert, who many of you know as the FWG's party co-chair, Yao Clement Malala, who is unfortunately unable to be here with us virtually, but he has pre-recorded some remarks that we'll be playing as part of the speaker series. We'll then begin a second part of our webinar, which is the 25-minute question and answer period. And as Tiffany mentioned at the outset, if you have any questions for the speakers, we'll be monitoring the Q&A function throughout the webinar. And please submit your questions or comments through that Q&A function. Before we get started, I'd also just remind everyone that there is interpretation available in English, Spanish, Russian, and French, and you can access that by clicking the interpretation button below. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Daly to introduce our speakers and the first part of the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. We are very fortunate to be joined by Jessica Wegner. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She is King Mai from Western New South Wales in Australia. She has a diploma on Indigenous land management, small business, and project management, and has undertaken an undergraduate degree in environmental science. Jessica is a junior board member for the jointly managed Mount Grenfell Historic Site and a board member of an Aboriginal women's group. She has been working in land rights for a number of years to progress economic opportunities for Aboriginal communities through balancing their social, cultural, environmental, and economic growth capacity to deliver land management opportunities that are supportive of revitalizing traditional knowledge in healing country. She is currently developing a pilot in the Hunter region for a Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation Regional Indigenous Fire Training course in New South Wales. In relation to climate change, she has stated, "My biggest passion is addressing the big picture of climate change and how cultural connection to the landscape is the key. I see this as the most sustainable and ecologically enhancing connectedness way forward to live more consciously as a sustainable society." Welcome, Jessica. Greatly appreciate you joining us this morning, and I now turn the floor over to you for your presentation. Priyanka.
Thank you for your warm welcome. It's 2 o'clock in the morning here in Australia, New South Wales, on Awabakal country, Yama. My name is Jessica Wegner. I'm a Nyampa Wangaiban woman, and I would like to do an acknowledgement. Here in Australia, it's extremely important for Indigenous people to acknowledge our past, present, and future. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement to all Indigenous people here on the line today and pay my respects to all that have entered my life and allowed me to learn on the journey that I've been on in my life too. I would like to talk today about different pathways that we've been able to use within the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation here in Australia. It's a national Indigenous fire workshop, as well as the advocate for local Indigenous communities to use our voice and use their voices on a platform that allows for Indigenous leadership. The Fire Sticks Alliance was created to revitalise the use of traditional cultural fire management across our landscape here in Australia. The land here in Australia was pretty much shaped by Indigenous people for thousands of years. Some scientists say over 80,000 years. My people say that it's been forever. In ensuring our advocacy for Indigenous revival and leadership of land management practices such as cultural fire management, we use different pathways to understand the past, present, and future. In the past, our people have used cultural fire management for revitalising the landscape, ensuring that the cured grasses and the vegetation in which each of the different landscapes are situated provide new, fresh growth for both the animals in which live in that landscape, as well as the people that use that landscape for hunting and gathering, making bread, and also our pathways, we call our songlines. only 250 years ago did colonization happen. And I would also like to acknowledge that that was the case, and that my ancestors only had almost three generations before me experience colonization. And in the process of colonization, our people were trying to share our knowledge and allow others to be able to understand the way in which we manage land with cultural fire management. We have stories from our ancestors and our most recent elders that showcase the use of cultural fire management on farmlands and trying to maintain that connection to country. In some ways, that connection has never been lost, and in others, it's in a state of revival. But most of Australia is subject to new regimes and new ways in which to apply cultural fire. Some of these ways are hazard reduction burns prescribed by local authorities such as the RFS. Another one is conservation burns, which are used by environmental scientists and ecologists to understand the landscape. Another one is savanna fire management. And the other one that's just starting to revive is our cultural fire management practice. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the purpose of all of these different regimes in an effort to understand the way in which cultural fire management has different elements and the use of cultural intellectual property and Indigenous ecological knowledge, and the pathways in which we use this revitalisation of this knowledge to be maintained, respected, and have purpose within our landscape again. The primary purpose of a hazard reduction burn is to reduce the ground cover. These are usually used in a way that is quite harmful to the environment and has one prescription, and it's to reduce the fuel load. This fuel load is usually reduced by using drip torches, a way in which to apply hotter fire to get the job done faster. A lot of our local communities participate in this. It's a volunteer position to work with the RFS, and there's not enough understanding in which the right type of fire would be applied. The introduction of hazard reduction burn has a relationship with life and property. Its validation is done through landscape scales and also limited on-ground assessments. The result is varied and is usually put in at the late season of wildfires. When we apply cultural fire management practices in the landscape using our traditional knowledge, we come from a place of our purpose being to maintain cultural protocols, ceremonies, laws, responsibility for country. Our aim is to maintain the health of country, plants, animals, soil, and also taking into account the weather. The aim there is to work in a cycle and seasonality with those key elements within the landscape. Planning is usually done by maintaining health, by on-country assessments, permissions to burn from traditional owners and knowledge holders, reading the seasons through knowing the indicators within the landscape. Assessments are usually done by responsiveness to seasonality, weather, climate, species, vegetation systems, vegetation types, soil types, landscape aquatic systems, neighbouring clans and language groups, and kinship systems. The tools and methods, rather than using trip torches and limited knowledge, We use bark torches, burning systems within and across systems, multiple spaces, single ignition points, observing weather conditions through the seasons and throughout the day, navigating markers within the landscape, knowledge of country, vegetation, curing, fire breaks, protection, and aquatic resources, and knowledge on how to read the fire within the landscape, reading country indicators, timing and seasons of and drying and curing within the landscape. The scale in which we apply fire is micro. It results in the landscape scale being derived by the vegetation and the grasses and the influence of the vegetation that's supported by the soil type, and usually goes out within country indicators, being rock formations, river systems, and change in vegetation type. Monitoring on-country assessments across fire areas, assessments of health and country. These are indicators that we use now because of the last 200 years and the revival state that we are in usually comes from a place that we call sick country. We act from a place of wanting to repair the country rather than maintaining its health in only 200 years. The results of using cultural fire management are starting to be acknowledged. And the way in which we use these indicators and repair the results is through maintenance of culture, holistic fire management, and multiple species benefits. The Fire Sticks Alliance has been using Indigenous leadership strategies to engage with our local Aboriginal communities across Australia, from the bottom of Tasmania all the way up to the top of Cape. We are a voice that supports these communities to approach us and ask for support to revitalise their knowledge and have time and space in which they can have these discussions with their local communities and the local fire authorities that are now in place. The way in which we do support the revitalisation of cultural fire management is through traditional practices, knowing what to do, knowing what it does, and knowing how it works, and knowing our responsibility to this through our kinship systems and through other pathways. We've been able to see the revitalisation of cultural fire management in many spaces and places across Australia. We've also gone overseas. Victor Stephenson, who is one of our lead fire practitioners, has travelled to other countries to help support them with the revitalisation of their cultural fire management practices too. It's the results of being engaged in cultural fire management allows us to be able to hold cultural fire circles and discuss with our local people about how they want to apply their knowledge and revitalise their knowledge. So it comes from a place of hurt first, and understanding that that dispossession happened, and then allowing a pathway forward. I think in the other seminars you've touched on climate change and the use of Indigenous knowledge within the practice of revival, and cultural fire management is a practical application of this and shows huge results of the similarities between our way of managing country and the way in which we can move into the future in knowledge synthesis. When we're talking about knowledge synthesis, my understanding is that this is used to co-produce something that can be understood and brought into the modern day. In our research and our understanding of Aboriginal engagement, it's more so co-production and co-creation with Indigenous leadership that allows these pathways forward. There are a lot of community stakeholders, Indigenous people that need to be consulted during the process of this revitalisation stage that we are in to use traditional ecological knowledge within the landscape. We're in the process of supporting our Aboriginal communities to draw up and utilise Indigenous ecological knowledge clauses with organisations in which they work so that they can maintain their IP, Indigenous protected intellectual property, to feel like to understand that they do have that ability to maintain their knowledge without someone coming in and turning it into their own research. That's a key element in reviving this knowledge and utilising it into the future and showcasing cultural burning or any traditional knowledge practice that is continued. The other learning that I would like to discuss today is what Indigenous leadership looks like in practice. And am I going over time?
Yeah, I think if you can continue and then begin to wrap up, this is really illuminating.
Thank you. So I'd like to talk about Indigenous leadership and what it looks like on ground. The Fire Sticks Alliance and many Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people have been working really hard to understand these practices. The use of Dr. Peter Stanley's Importance of Campfires research paper that can be found online allows for the pathway in which we start to revitalise this knowledge and allow for Indigenous leadership. It has to come from our Aboriginal leaders within the communities. It has to be allowed to go through that process of understanding that there was a disconnection for however many years in whatever country we're in when we're practicing traditional knowledge and sharing it. There needs to be an acknowledgement and always acknowledge where that knowledge comes from and that it's not individually owned, it's owned as a community and has responsibilities through kinship systems. And these systems are in practice to allow for many to participate in traditional ecological knowledge and maintain that knowledge and pass it on to our next generations. My son, he's 8 years old. He's been attending cultural fire management programs since he was 3 years old. And this is the first time that someone in my family has ever learnt from such a young age because of that dispossession. And I tell that story because it's a revitalisation of our culture within my line of family. I'm very happy to be able to say that that cycle of dispossession is starting to be removed from my family line. Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous leadership in this space allows for the right people, right time, and the right responsibilities to be embedded within a landscape. These responsibilities are very much based within our totemistic systems as well. I am a Nyampa Wangaiban woman of the Pila Kailu tree people. The Pila Kailu is a she-oak tree people. I have responsibilities for that vegetation type. And the story that I'd like to finish on is that the Pila Kailu tree is a fire-loving tree. It was given and it was maintained for thousands of years as a totem within my family because it lives within our river systems. It maintains and holds up soil banks. And it also doesn't need fire. So my people would burn around the Pilar Kailu trees to maintain the integrity of that tree. If it was to receive fire, then it would, what's the word? It would take over that ecosystem, which is what we're seeing here today. We're seeing a huge amount of one vegetation type that has received too much fire within our landscapes within Australia. We're seeing that sick country, and we're also not using the elements to be able to maintain this. When one species takes over an environment, it doesn't allow for that diversity to happen in the food in which those animals and people need to be able to maintain that, and it changes the ecology of that area. And we're talking about climate change and the utilisation of Indigenous ecological knowledge. I ask that everyone that's listening think about the right type of fire, the right type of practice, the use of traditional ecological knowledge that is supportive of revitalising the custodians for that land. Their knowledge, their systems, and their practices are well embedded within the landscape in which they live, and they have responsibilities to those. It's not just connected to the landscape, it's connected to the air, it's connected to the waters, and it's connected to the sky and the stars. There are so many different indicators within traditional ecological knowledge elements that need to be taken into consideration when applying and using traditional ecological knowledge. It can't be utilised as just one element within one regime, and it can't be one size fits all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for bringing your world views and perspectives to us, and especially anchoring this in the, as you point out, relatively recent colonization in the long history of your people, and the use of these land management practices really as a point of revitalization. I think this, everything that you've shared is very significant, and it's enlightening for me, and I'm sure many others, to learn from you. I wish we could have a lengthier conversation and to hear more, but I guess it takes maybe a visit to your country to and to your people. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Ana Curtula de Chave, who is a lifelong Alaskan and social cultural anthropologist. Her research has spanned 4 decades of fieldwork in the Arctic, during which she covered a diverse range of topics from land use patterns and subsistence economies to identity, household organization, and domestic violence. She served as the program director of the Arctic Social Sciences program at the U.S. National Science Foundation, and as the Associate Director of the Alaska Governor's Office in Washington, D.C., where her portfolio included natural resources, rural affairs, environmental conservation, and fisheries. During her 16 years of federal service at the National Science Foundation, under Anna's guidance, the Arctic Social Sciences program set the standard for Arctic Indigenous community participation in scientific research projects. As program director, Anna focused on ways to create partnerships between Arctic communities and academic researchers, from encouraging and funding Arctic Indigenous researchers, scholars, and organizations to a multitude of educational programs. I am really pleased that you can join us today, Anna. And I have to say that Anna has certainly been one of the advocates for Indigenous knowledge and engagement of Indigenous knowledge holders in a host of different federally funded programs. Please, the virtual microphone is yours, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Daly. You've also saved me from having to introduce myself, which is great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Super. First of all, I want to thank the Anacostan people on whose traditional lands I'm sitting today. I am both an ancestral and natal person from the Arctic. I never thought I would spend as much time in Washington as I have, but it's become a second home. So I want to thank the people whose land I'm sitting on. I also want to thank Daly and Tom for being the co-hosts of this and for all the work that you're doing on bringing issues of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities to the forefront, particularly vis-a-vis climate change. So I just want to start, hang on, I'm gonna change my view here. Okay, great. I just want to start to say that, you know, white people are generally trained to be comfortable speaking for everybody, and especially if they're academically trained, which I am. And so while I prefer to listen at large gatherings, I'm a conventionally trained scientist. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my pathway to working more collaboratively and supporting the co-production of knowledge. Particularly, my focus has been on the Arctic, so I'm going to talk about the Arctic today. I want to just share with you really quickly one of my epiphanies that led me down this track was when I was working in the village of Sirenak, which is in the Russian far northeast. I was working with sea mammal hunters and going hunting with them because at that time period, which I hate to say how long ago it is because I aged myself, but you know, over 30 years ago, participatory models were not, were just beginning to come to the foreground, but we weren't really using them. So I say that my work was really participant observational models, which is the way anthropologists operated at the time, but not really co-production. And I regret that now looking back on it, because I think I could have had a lot more insights had my work been certainly more collaborative. But I was going hunting and I was talking with one of the hunters, Pangawi, and he was saying to him, you know, I heard that you all were trained in sea mammal hunting. I mean, I knew obviously of the long millennial, since time immemorial, sea mammal hunting tradition among the Yupik people of this region. But I also knew that when the Russians came in, or the Soviets, it was still the Soviet period at that time, they took sea mammal hunters and sent them to Khabarovsk and trained them in how to be sea mammal hunters, which I was sort of astounded at and sort of fascinated by. So I said to Pangawi, how was your time in Khabarovsk? Did you learn anything? And he said, oh, yeah, I learned a few things. He said, I learned how to use a compass, but of course I never, ever saw him use a compass. And so that was when I started thinking about, wait a minute here, what irony that a group of Soviets would be training. Anyway, so I started down this pathway of recognition and understanding and becoming more collaborative. So I'm going to show some slides. I don't like to read slides, and since we're time constricted, I'll read even less. Maybe I'll just describe what's on some of the slides. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, and here we go. Now I have to move it into, okay, all these little boxes. Sorry, I'm minimally competent. Okay, I want to start with this brief, I said I was going to talk a little bit about people in the Arctic And so I wanted to start with this quote from the Arctic Human Development Report because it tells you a little bit about Arctic societies. You'll all be able to access this PowerPoint on the web later. So like I said, I'm going to try not to read too much, but I think it's important to read the first line, which is Arctic societies have a well-deserved reputation for resilience in the face of change. Basically goes on to say, but of course, climate change, economic change, cultural developments, industrial development is all becoming just increasing the effects that climate change is having on Arctic peoples. And, all of this obviously starting with colonization, but to understand that Arctic people are they're used to change and readily adapted to change in the Arctic environment. But it's not just the speed, but all of the different areas within their society that's being impacted by change. And so that's why I wanted to put this quote up. I think it's an important one. This is because I'm a scientist. I'm going to talk a little bit about science and scientific models. I thought Akalakling, and this was in 2007. So think we've been talking about this for quite some time, where basically he's saying, defining the various ways in which, colonization and then scientific investigation, but they really haven't included Indigenous people. And let's hope that this century will be the inclusion and the collaboration with Indigenous people in science. And I 100% agree with him and support it in my own work with the National Science Foundation and continue to work towards this goal, and hopefully it will happen long before the end of this century. So here's, just because I'm an academic, you get to see all these little models. I get to talk about models for a minute. And we're all familiar, or most of us have experienced or are familiar with the 20th century models, which were started with colonial models of scientists basically doing research on and in the Arctic. An infamous anthropologist, a physical anthropologist named Alois Hrdlicka, was notorious because he went through Yukon villages, which are Dene villages. And if you know much about Dene culture, they have very specific, as everybody does, but they prefer not to handle or speak about the dead, don't use the names of dead and of dead people, and have very specific practices surrounding the dead. And Hrdlicka would go in, and because many of the cemeteries were on top of the ground, he would basically pick up the skulls because he was interested in measuring skulls, and would walk through Dene villages with large, what we call, what could be described as skull racks. He had strung them all together and hung them over his shoulder and walked through these villages on his way back. The Smithsonian has been working long to repatriate a lot of this material, but this was very early 20th century. And in fact, on the Yukon, when I was growing up, traveling with my father on the Yukon, people would still use Hrdlicka as the boogeyman. They would say, if you're not careful, Hrdlicka will get you. And so I call that one of the ugliest models of doing science, basically ignoring anything about local people as if they had any rights and just doing what you want to do. There's a certain chauvinism in science that I call, scientific expertise has been, if it's good for science, then it's got to be good for everybody. There's a primacy of scientific expertise, and certainly in 20th century models that persists today. As a social scientist, and I worked in the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. I was the lone social scientist, and in the beginning, one of the few women in that program, working with a lot of natural and physical scientists. And there was really a pecking order of science. And then there's certainly a pecking order from science to communities. One of the things I would hear all the time is that what people tell you is anecdotal. It's not real science. There's no information there. And that was when I first arrived. And I worked very hard to let people recognize that that's actually not true. People have been observing the world for thousands of years, And science is basically based in observations. And so over time, some of the better, as I say, at best here, 20th century models were disseminating information, but it was primarily through journals, publishing, disseminating information primarily through journals and through classrooms and through your students. That later involved bringing information back to communities, because communities are interested in what scientists are finding out. But in the 20th century, as I said, it was primarily presenting science in science formats. There was a growth of hiring local labor, and now I'm speaking specifically about Alaska and Chukotka, where I worked, which, the good thing about hiring local labor is you're getting some funding into local communities, and there's more exposure to what scientists are doing, and more exposure to local knowledge through having these relationships. Education and outreach, primarily scientists going into classrooms and giving their science talk. That has it's good. I used to tell scientists, look, the minimum you can do is, if you're near a village, is to go in and talk to a teacher and see if they have time for you to give a talk to a classroom. I always said, if you've never met a biologist, how do you know whether you want to be one or not? As this evolved, we started hearing a lot about Indigenous knowledge, TEK, traditional knowledge, environmental knowledge became important in 20th century, but I still say it was primarily Indigenous knowledge in service to science. Scientists were creating the projects, they were defining the questions, and then if somebody had something interesting to say that we could consider data, we'll reach out to the Indigenous community and talk to some elders. And cooperation, where Indigenous people, primarily in the form of people working on your science question and your science problem. And that was some of the best that was coming out of the 20th century models of doing science with communities in the Arctic. I've called this next slide New Models for Scientific Research, and this is more the 21st century community dissemination, meaning returning to communities where you've worked or where you've worked around, discussing what you've found out, discussing what they'd like to know, and bringing the information back to communities in a form that they can understand. Maybe that sounds a little bit pejorative, but in ways in which they can engage with the data. And sometimes scientists go back and speak English to Yupik communities where elders don't speak English, not as a first language and not as a language that they're certainly going to understand science in. And so translators and engaging your audience with the data has become a new model for science research. Cooperation, certainly working with communities, engaging with communities themselves in the scientific research. It's a better model. It's not the model that I promote most, but it's a better model. Collaboration is talking and working together with communities and answering science questions. But again, even in collaboration, most of the ideas were coming from scientists, not really addressing local people's issues, which is important. And I think that's where co-production becomes really important, power sharing. Not going into a community saying, although it's better than a 20th century model, but not going into a community and saying, hey, this is what I'm interested in. Would you help me? But going into a community and saying, what things are you interested in? And when I say scientists, I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about conventionally trained scientists, which I prefer to calling things Western science, because Western is sort of where you are in the world. Different people are in the West, but that's sort of the term we all use, and we think of Europeans as Western science, Europeans and North Americans, but conventional science is what I prefer to use. And in sharing work, conventional scientists can be Indigenous people. We have many Indigenous people who are trained as conventional scientists, and they frequently become great boundary spanners, working between the two communities. But even if you're not, you may be working with traditional scholars or Indigenous scholars that aren't conventionally trained scientists, sharing the power, understanding what questions they're interested in. What does the community want to know about themselves? And working together in producing new knowledge. That's, in my mind, from the questions asked to writing the proposals, to collecting the data, to analyzing the data, to the publications. That's co-production. When communities are in the mix from the very definition of the problem. And then, of course, science sovereignty, which in the Arctic, a lot of people know, a lot of communities know that the Arctic may not be, no pun intended, the hottest topic for scientists. Scientists come and go. They may be in the Arctic now because they have a really interesting atmospheric conditions, but they will move on and go somewhere else. And Indigenous communities understand that. And so they want their own members to be trained in a way so that they can continue to answer the questions that they have about climate change and other aspects of their communities long after conventional scientists are gone. So now, let's see, I wanted to play, let's hope this video works. If it doesn't work, they said they will post it on the web. It's a video that I call Cooperation. They had a local community member was working directly with the scientists in basically being a community liaison. So it's more a cooperative function than a collaborative. So here is, let me know daily if, put a thumbs down if it's not working, and I'll move on.
Our culture will be threatened if we don't have ice. You know, it's all based around ice. We're taught to watch the ice, watch the current, wind direction, and everything evolves around the ice. Our way of life is very delicate. It's a very fragile ecosystem we're living in. One of our main diets is the walrus. Without the ice to support the walrus, and without the walrus to support our culture, it's a scary thought. I think it benefits both the scientists and us to come together and share our own knowledges. You know, I've learned a lot from the scientists. I didn't think it was this serious, but when I'm talking with the scientists, they're pretty sure of where it's headed. You know, the ice is receding faster than they anticipated, and it's scary. It's worth caring about because we're all in the same boat, so to speak, you know. If something's wrong, everybody's gonna be affected. I can't imagine living in a place without ice, and I can't imagine myself living anywhere else.
Oops, okay, let's see. Okay, I'm not going to read this. I'll just mention briefly that last video was produced as part of the Bering ecosystem study that started in the early 2000s. And I believe it's not going to be 2040. I think that sea ice has been disappearing a lot faster than what those models predicted. And so that was a very nice collaboration between a number of local community partners, but all the questions and all the science and all the data was collected by conventionally trained scientists. That's why I called it cooperation. This is Heather Sayuk Jean Gordon, and she's a social scientist She did her master's work in Greenland, trying to understand what Greenlanders would like to see from scientists and how you can create more collaborative and co-production work. And basically, she found trust was very important in the way in which the Inuit define trust. And you can see her work, and I put it up here: behaving culturally appropriate, understanding the history, and exchanging knowledge and communicating. All these things went into what the Inuit described as trust, which was very important to them. I put up Paul Nadejdi's work. He is an anthropologist who works in he basically was speaking to the anthropological community, but I think it's really important to think about, and I applaud Paul's work, and actually had a chance to fund some of it when I was at the National Science Foundation, because he's talking about why are we always assuming that scientific knowledge is the truth? And what would it, and that understanding that as a basic premise for the way we set policy and do management, is turning the world on its head. And I think this is important for a lot of people on this webinar, because some of you are policy managers, and you're going to be looking at management and other issues vis-a-vis this issue of climate change. And understanding how that very essential worldview of the primacy of science has actually marginalized Indigenous people in this practice. And Paul envisions a world where Indigenous people could be, their systems of knowledge are both literally, that we base he talks mainly about management, co-management policy, because that's what he's studied, but that they are literally true as well as metaphorically valid. And anthropologists have played lip service to this, but he's talking specifically here about how we need to think about our theories. So I encourage you to read some of Paul's work as well, because it is a basis for using an understanding of the knowledge of Indigenous people as actually literal, not just metaphorical, which indeed it is, being based on millennia of observations. So the next project I call collaboration, the meaning of ice. We talk a lot about ice in the Arctic. You've heard that thing about how Inuit people have hundreds of words for snow. Actually, it's hundreds of words for ice. They understand ice very intimately. The meaning of ice was a project. It's over 10 years now. It went on. It was a collaboration for 10 years between scientists at the University of Colorado, University of Alaska, and the University of Greenland. The Inuit, Inupiat, and Inuit community members participated in this project. It was a model. The final book was published in all 4 languages, including English, Inuktitut, Inupiaq, and Kalaallisut. And this was I call it collaboration, because although it was very co-production, and when you take a look at this book, and I encourage you to look at it, it was a very co-production project, but collaboration because the original idea of looking at ice came from the conventionally trained scientists. So it wasn't, even though Indigenous people in the Arctic are really interested in ice and they know a lot about it, and I'm sure this was one of their top concerns, the melting sea ice, it was still the original ideas came from the scientists. And so that's why I call it a really great collaboration. This next is just to give you, I like to use this slide with scientists a lot, because the top slide is a word cloud of how scientists speak about ice, and the bottom slide is a word cloud about how Indigenous communities speak about ice. And you can see the largest, darkest words are the words used the most, if you're not familiar with word clouds. And you can see how incredibly different, but how still both of these word clouds are reality, and not just metaphorical perception of what's going on with ice. So I really, and these are in the book, I really love that visual, particularly for scientists when I'm trying to tell them, listen to what people are telling you. I just wanted to bring this up really briefly. This is Chillista elders. This is what I call science sovereignty, in that Mark John, it used to be called Chillista elders. It's now called Chillista education and culture. About 20 years ago, CEC, under the director, Mark John, working in concert with Anne Feinup Reardon, who really became just a facilitator. The elders said, our knowledge is disappearing. It's going to be really important for the next generation to have this knowledge. And they went about these listening workshops where they would bring elders in and community members, and elders would talk. And then they were publishing these books as a result. It's an amazing project. It has created, that I was honored to be able to help facilitate with funding, created over 19 publications, and I have the URL here at the bottom, so you can go there. And it's really the world from UPIC elders' vision and knowledge of their world. And it's a marvelous, what I call science sovereignty project, because the UPIC people defined the project and they've been working on it for 2 decades now. It's extraordinary. These are just a few projects from COERIC. COERIC is an Alaskan Native nonprofit organization, and they have a lot of resources on their website as well. This is how they've worked a lot on this issue of co-production of knowledge, and this is gives you sort of their definition, and then a couple of the books that were published and by them. And their website is also has a lot of great resources, and I just kind of wanted to give them a plug. And because we're supposed to talk about what makes a good co-production of knowledge project, here's what COERIC, some of the premises that COERIC put out. And this was a response to an NSF RFP, which was an announcement for proposals, a solicitation of proposals called Navigating the New Arctic, which continues today. And before I left the National Science Foundation, I was able to instill in them that these projects needed full community collaboration. And I kind of created a monster because I left. And then what happened is exactly what we were asking scientists not to do, which is define your project and to go and look for a community. And I always said at NSF that people would define these projects and then they'd come to me and say, oh, we forgot a social scientist. Can you give us some names? And that practice persisted and actually created a big burden on Indigenous communities for participating long after the questions had all been defined. And so COERIC wrote a letter to National Science Foundation after I was gone, and that's on the letter is on their website. You can access it, or I can send it to Daly and she can post it. But these were some of the things that they talked about. Let local Indigenous priorities guide programs. Extremely important. Don't create your management program. Don't create your ideas and then go to local Indigenous communities or any local communities and say, hey, we've got this great program for you. That just can't continue and can't work and will not be successful, not because local people won't adapt it. They often do. But the problem is that it doesn't fit the local circumstances and ignores that local people have this knowledge that benefits them and benefits you. And I'm saying managers because I don't know how many scientists are on here, but critical. Let Indigenous priorities guide your programs. You may think grass is the most important thing. Like I said, you may think snow is the most important thing in an Alaskan Inuit community. And lo and behold, it's not snow, it's ice. And it took scientists decades to figure that out. And the Inuit knew that ice was critical way before. Snow's important too, but ice is what they knew was critical that would have the greatest effect on their lives. And it would have been nice for scientists to figure that out maybe a couple decades ago. So the last thing I want to share with you is one of my favorite videos, because I worked with reindeer, not herding, but herding people. They didn't travel with reindeer, the Chukchi, but this is the Nenets. A man named Bruce Forbes printed this, and I just want to give you a sound of the tundra as we leave the Arctic to talk about other things, so that you have a sense of what this can sound like. Oops. Wrong arrow. So if you've never been around reindeer, a lot of that clicking is a tendon in their back legs, not actually crushing the tundra, which kind of brings fond memories of home to me. So I'll stop there. Thank you for letting me spend this time with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Anna. Quite a lot revealed there, especially when you started with the 20th century models and some of the developments that have brought us a little closer to genuine co-production of knowledge. I am now really pleased to introduce Alicia Mousseau. Dr. Mousseau has a firm grounding in family and community. And I really appreciated that when she sent her biography that she indicated her hunka, her parents, her family. I just greatly appreciated that. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Wyoming. Her professional focus includes working with tribal and university partners, and more specifically with the National Native Children's Trauma Center, developing a supplement to a school-based cognitive behavioral trauma intervention for American Indian youth, creating a collaborative trauma-resilient tribal systems framework, and providing trauma training and technical assistance to tribal communities and entities. She has also worked with the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health, culturally adapting, implementing, and evaluating a family-based substance use prevention program with Lakota families. Her other work focuses on examining self-regulation, effect, and health behaviors among American Indian youth, including implementing and evaluating the influence of mindfulness techniques among reservation-dwelling youth. Overall, Dr. Mousseau is dedicated to promoting prevention and health equity in American Indian communities through culturally and contextually relevant ways of knowing and capacity building. We were fortunate to share the screen on a recent The Hill program, and though I don't know you well, I was really struck by your commentary about the importance of Indigenous knowledge. So I'm grateful that you're here with us today, and the virtual microphone is yours, Alicia, and you have about 10 minutes. I've been getting chat notices, but I've seen your PowerPoint, so off to you.
Thank you, Dr. Doro. Yeah, so Dr. Doro and I met on the Hill randomly, and I'm realizing as I navigate and walk through life that talking about Indigenous knowledge is something that's normal in our community. I'm from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I am the vice president for the Oglala Sioux tribe right now, but my previous experience is a career in research and I'm trained in clinical psychology, and so bringing that to my community and navigating that, and merging the two, it has become something that I bring into everything I do, and especially talking about our traditional ways of knowing here. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here, my PowerPoint, I believe. All right. So as Dr. Doro said, I usually introduce myself through my family. That's how we do in my community. So my name is Alicia Mousseau. My parents are the late John and Vera Mousseau. My grandparents are the late James and Lena Mousseau, and we're from Porcupine, South Dakota. My hunka, or adopted family, is my parents are Howard and Karen Spoon Hunter Brown of Arapahoe, Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation. And my godchildren are Alexander and Marcella Braveheart and Gia Soraya and Joe Weston of Calico, South Dakota. So I'm very excited to talk about how to engage with Indigenous knowledge. Like I said, it's something that I normally just kind of talk about, and something we normally do in our community because we're raised with it, right? Like we're raised to introduce ourselves to our family. We're kinship, which was mentioned earlier. That's a big part of knowing who we are and who we come from. And the Oglala Sioux tribe also has a rich history of leaders that are huge in you know, our history and American history as well. We have defeated the United States Army, and you know, one of the only entities to defeat the United States Army. So, you know, that is definitely rich in our history, and we carry that through to today. And so our Indigenous law, our ways of knowing, our traditional ways of knowing are still very strong in our community. And having worked with other tribal communities and through previous employments, I've realized how strong our cultural connection still is, and our understanding is to our ancestors and our connection in those ways. And it's just something that's kind of innate and is taught in our school. So the co-production of knowledge, as I've gone through my own learning and education, I've realized, you know, there's similarities, and along the way, I've become kind of an adaptation. I don't want to say expert, but I've always been leaned on to adapt things and figure out how to do that, utilizing our traditional knowledge in our community. And going through, we have a lot of tribal colleges, so I've gone through our tribal college here in my community, Oglala Lakota College, and that's how that is taught there as well, and in our school. So we're taught it even in our colleges, our tribal colleges, and our schools on the reservation. And so, you know, going into grad school and such, you can see the parallels. So I've been able to draw those parallels. So as you can see here, there's a graph, and you know, there's a winter count and ways of keeping track. And a lot of our communities are oral. So we keep track through winter counts and things like that. Nothing was necessarily written in language, but it was displayed in art and different pieces. And so the co-production of knowledge, for me, you know, you can see the similarities even in these graphs in the winter count, the sort of type of how do you keep track of things, right? Through graphics and such. This is another model I always like to use. The buffalo, the bison have been our relatives, and we call them the Pateo Yate. They're our relatives because we depended on them. And as you can see, there's many things we utilize the bison for, including our homes, including food, including, you know, like utensils and different weapons and all types of things, and we used every part of the bison. We had a relationship, so like I said, relationships are huge for us, and that's how we understand how to move about and how to relate and how to interact with different things in our environment. And one common saying in our community for Lakota people, Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people is Madakiase. And it means we're all related. And if we understand our relation to the things that give us life, you know, not just other human beings, but the environment, the animals, we are able to navigate and move through the world and with respect and those other values that we hold as tribal people and as Lakota people. So I always like to show this just because it does show how we've interacted, how we've created relationships, and how we utilize our environments, but also pay respect to that environment by utilizing every piece, and creating a relationship so that we can, you know, utilize our environment in a way that's respectful. you know, and I'm also scientifically trained. And so you can see this very dynamic model, which has a lot of pieces. And I'm not going to go into all these pieces, but I would like to show this coming from the Buffalo model to this model of, you know, it is very complex to create those relationships to co-produce knowledge. And so this is a model that's produced out of a collaboration with the University of New Mexico, the National Congress of American Indian Policy and Research Center, and the University of Washington Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. So as you can see, there's even collaboration in developing this for collaboration. And CBPR is community-based participatory research. And I know previous panelists talked about that relationship and creating those collaborations. And you know, as scientists, we like to put things on paper and, you know, to draw models and say, you know, give ways to that. But the biggest part that I just want to really touch on is relationships are so important from the beginning to the end, right? And there probably is no end, but creating that beginning relationship and going through every piece of research and every piece of you know, collaboration is so important. And so I just wanted to show this because it is very complex. And we are trying to figure out how to do that, how to create those relationships with universities, with other research institutes, and tribal communities. One project that I have worked on before my current position was I worked with the University of Colorado with the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health. And we worked on a project called Tiwahe Gluashakapi. And this project is one project in a long line. I showed you that previous slide of all the how to do community-based participatory research, but this came out of previous research and previous relationships with our communities and epidemiological studies showed foundational you know, data on things that are going on in our community, including substance use, mental health, and other things that we know impact our communities. And you know, this epidemiological study showed this scientifically, and so then communications with the community started, because a lot of our communities want, you know, we know there are issues, but now what can we do, right? What now? What can we do? And so those conversations had begun and were starting. And so we had a community advisory board that really, you know, said, you need to do a family-based program, substance use prevention program. And so taking that information from our community advisory board, which include local elders and, you know, substance use researchers in our community and you know, clinicians in our community, all tribal folks, we looked to the empirical data. And so we found a variety of different, you know, empirically supported interventions for families and brought them back to the community advisory board. So it was definitely that relationship communication. And we settled on the Iowa State Strengthening Families program for 10 to 14-year-olds and their parents. And our community advisory board, we sat down with them once again, and like I said, it's that relationship has to be all the way through, and they really guided us on how to adapt that program. And a large part of that program was videos, and in those videos there was no American Indians. So what we did is we reshot all the videos, and it wasn't professionally done. You know, we have I did every part on that project, including helping with the videos, from getting people to cater to our families that were going through our program, to finding us an office space, right? Like, because in our communities, we don't have necessarily that foundation to support research. So that's another thing that we also need to work on. You know, we talk about top down, you know, getting funding and getting people to understand from universities and research centers and meeting us, but also in our communities, we need to also develop some foundational knowledge and foundational pieces in our own communities so we can meet in the middle somewhere. And that was one of the biggest things that I realized working on that research project is we need the capacity in our communities. And so through this project, as you can see, there's a couple pieces that we pulled out with our community advisory board to look at scientifically, but we really adapted that whole curriculum. But we pulled these 3 pieces out to look at scientifically, because that's the co-collaboration, right? That's where we pull the science pieces, pull what we know in our communities, and look at them. So what we did was, that was a kind of a nuclear family, how the whole program was set up. So we extended family, because we know our extended family is very important in our community. And so we utilize our Lakota language, because our traditional structure is not linear. We have a collateral relationship in our communities where, my mom's sisters would also be my mom, and my dad's brothers would also be my dad. So we incorporate that, and that's something we know in our communities, but we pulled it into this curriculum to make it a part of this curriculum. So it was embedded in there. We used Lakota language for those, because there are kinship terms with the Lakota language throughout. So we utilize that. We also know Facebook is huge in our community. So we wanted to look to see how we could utilize that in our research. And we found that, that Facebook, I think, is still a new thing. It's a way to get information out, but I don't know how we use it to engage community in research studies. So that one actually was not supported with the most design that we utilized. And last but not least, there was a substance use component in the original curriculum. And through previous research, we know that substance use doesn't necessarily, like DARE wasn't necessarily that effective. So we wanted to see if pulling out the substance use piece of the curriculum would still, make it effective if we really just focus on families supporting each other, learning how to communicate, learning how to use love and limits. But we found that our families really did like that substance use piece of learning how to communicate with their youth about substances, helping their youth do resistance skills. So this is one way that I've learned how to do this co-production of knowledge, utilizing our community advisory board. And our community advisory board was local, so I've known them growing up, and they continue to be my mentors to today. And so we've produced things like this in our community, but like I said, we need to create more of a foundation in our community. So because we're all told to go to school and get our education and come back and help our communities, but in our communities we also need to build that capacity where we can have scientists, we can have engineers, we can have people who are technology trained, the STEAM careers in our community. So that's one big push that we are looking at in my new role as vice president, because doing this project was a lot. It was a lot of work, and we do want our youth to come back to our community and be a part of our community and our fabric, and have those careers in STEAM. Some cultural and ethical considerations, there's a lot. And the previous panelists talked about it, and throughout, when you create that relationship though, that's where you can have these conversations, and where they can say, no, that's not going to work, and being like, okay. And so we had that relationship with our community advisory board through that project I worked on, and they told us to move certain things. And usually when you adapt curriculums, they're like, that's their baby, right? They don't want you to move or change anything. But through that collaboration and having that relationship, they heard from our community advisory board. They understood why it was important to move certain components, and they're like, okay. We could also look at those core components that were originally in the curriculum and some of our, traditional ways of knowing, and how they mapped on, and use those examples to illustrate those core elements of that original program. So, but it is that relationship that really helped us to do that, and really helped us to make all those changes. Really helped us to know our boundaries and what we could and could not put in the curriculum, because there is a lot of considerations, and I put cultural and ethical considerations together because sometimes they're one and the same. There's some things maybe we shouldn't look at scientifically, and we should be able to have those conversations, and they should start from the community. So I have a list of them, and I do not want to go through all of them because I know we're limited on time. But one thing I do want to bring home is that data is important. but it's also our stories. Like, that's one thing that we have to tell our stories now. One way we can utilize to tell our stories is through data, because we ask people a lot of questions, qualitative and quantitative data, and then we pull it together to create that story. And so that's one way that I like to explain data and research in our communities, and it's a new way to tell our stories through numbers, and a way to communicate outside of our communities that we know, data-driven knowledge and all these things. So it's one way we can bring that in, but there's a lot of things to consider along that way, but our relationships will definitely help us to guide us in understanding that. And so that is all I have. Thank you all for your time, and happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And here again, another presenter where we could spend probably a whole semester, not just a 10-minute presentation. So I'm just really, really grateful for what you've contributed, especially the listing of cultural and ethical considerations and elements that I was especially taken by the short phrase that numbers are people, that we talk about data, that we're talking about people and the human face to all of this, as well as the scientific results that you spoke about at the front end, and how it triggered activity within the community, and the work of the community advisory board and the project that it initiated. So I'm really grateful for that. So we have a pre-recorded program from our colleague Clement Yo Malala, who's a lawyer hailing from the island of Wa'ab in the Federated States of Micronesia. He's an international law consultant who specializes in international environmental law, particularly climate change and biodiversity conservation law, also the law of the sea and international indigenous law, with several articles and chapters published on these topics. Among other responsibilities, as we've said, he's currently the legal advisor for the permanent mission of the Federated States of Micronesia to the UN, and has represented the Federated States of Micronesia in various multilateral fora, including meetings of the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity. He is presently the co-chair of the facilitative working group, of which Activity 4 and this event today is a part of. He holds a Juris Doctorate from the William S. Richardson School of Law, and specializes in Pacific Asian legal studies through that educational training, and also an LLM in international legal studies from New York University School of Law. So we'd like to share the screen and pull up his approximately 13-minute presentation. I know that cuts into some of the Q&A, but he has some very useful examples that he'd like to share. So maybe the Secretariat can pull up Yo's presentation. Thank you. Again, thank you very much, Yo, for joining us for webinar number 3 of Activity 4. We're very pleased that you could prepare this recording for us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daly, and I very much appreciate your and the rest of the organizers' flexibility in working with me on this. I do apologize to the attendees that I'm unable to join you live, but I'm very happy to engage with you following from this. I do have a PowerPoint that I would like to share, so I'm going to try to share my screen right now. And Daly, if you don't mind confirming whether you can see my screen.
Yes, it's visible. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I was asked to participate in the webinar to give a bit of a discussion about engaging with Indigenous knowledge and holders of Indigenous knowledge. but through a slightly different prism, that of the ongoing negotiations for the BBNJ instrument, which is an instrument pertaining to ocean management that I am particularly involved in another venue. And so I will try to go through my engagement with the BBNJ instrument and the engagement of the broader Pacific SIDS with the negotiations, and see if there may be some lessons that can be applied to work under the UNFCCC, especially in connection with the topic of our webinar today. So just very briefly, the BBNJ instrument is meant to be a treaty under the Law of the Sea Convention that focuses on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And just to give a bit of an overview of the Pacific region to which I belong, the Pacific Island states, Pacific Island countries and territories. You see this map here on the screen that encompasses 23 Pacific Island countries and territories, including 14 Pacific SIDS, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And we cover about 30 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone of the ocean, including several pockets of high seas that you see there. And as a region, we've managed to work fairly well together in the BBNJ negotiations, in part because of longstanding historical and cultural connections to the ocean and its resources. In that connection, in the negotiations for the BBNJ instrument, the Pacific SIDS and a number of other like-minded delegations have proposed three types of traditional knowledge, what we call traditional knowledge, which is our sort of catch-all phrase for traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and local knowledge. So three types of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities that we feel are relevant to the BBNJ instrument. The first type is the sort of connectivity type, the idea that there is relevant traditional knowledge pertaining to marine species of cultural significance that range between coastal waters and areas beyond national jurisdiction. And you see these studies here about whales and seals and sea lions and turtles and a number of other culturally significant marine species that range between coastal communities and the high seas, and for which there is traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities. The second type of relevant traditional knowledge that we've highlighted is this idea of environmental management best practices in coastal waters. The idea that coastal communities have millennia of experience with how to manage their ocean spaces and their coastal spaces in a sustainable way. And we've drawn on different examples from the Pacific, taking an ecosystem approach and various marine tenure and management approaches for seasonal closures, permanent closures, rotational closures, and so forth throughout the Pacific, with the Ahupua'a in Hawaii and the Pu'awa in Solomon Islands and the Rahui in Aotearoa. These different management practices we feel are useful best practices for the BBNJ instrument. And the third type of traditional knowledge that we think is relevant to the BBNJ instrument that has to do with traditional navigation. The idea that there are still quite a few societies and communities, at least in the Pacific, that practice open ocean instrument-free traditional navigation across the high seas. They've been doing it for millennia, and they've developed knowledge about fish aggregation sites, spawning sites, migratory paths of marine species, and so forth, including in areas beyond national jurisdiction, that can be very useful for informing different measures under the BBNJ instrument. And you might recall several years ago that there was a worldwide traditional navigation voyage that sailed out of Hawaii, the Hokulea, that you see here, that visited the United Nations, that tried to highlight, among other things, the importance of indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge to ocean conservation and management. And so with those types of traditional knowledge in mind that we see being relevant to the BBNJ instrument, the Pacific SIDS governments, including my own, the Federated States of Micronesia, we've tried to adhere to a number of principles in terms of how we engage with indigenous peoples and local communities and the knowledge that they hold. And I have a listing of a number of principles here that we've tried to honor in the negotiations for the BBNJ instrument, including in specific text that we've proposed in the BBNJ instrument. First of all, we recognize that what we call traditional knowledge is a living body of knowledge. It's not a stay, or it's not an outdated or antiquated body of knowledge, but it's a living body of knowledge that's constantly evolving, that belongs to holders, so indigenous peoples and local communities, and we feel is directly relevant to the various environmental management efforts that we highlight. The second sort of principle of engagement that we have is that we view traditional knowledge as a complement to best available scientific information, or Western science, or lab coat science. We do not consider traditional knowledge to be subordinate in any way to best available scientific information. We recognize that traditional knowledge has its own systems for generation and production, for validating itself, for being applied, and that we do not view these systems as less rigorous or less valid than that for best available scientific information. Another principle that we've adhered to the extent possible is that for anything in the BBNJ instrument that impacts holders of relevant traditional knowledge, we want to make sure that such holders are actively consulted by governments involved in the BBNJ instrument and given the full opportunity to provide relevant feedback. And that feedback and those views need to be given weight that is equal to best available scientific information in management decisions under the BBNJ instrument. And the Pacific SIDS have proposed texts throughout the BBNJ negotiations that put best available scientific information and relevant traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities on equal footing in a textual, legally binding manner. The fourth sort of principle of engagement that we've tried to follow is that we've been pushing for the enshrinement of dedicated seats or spaces in different institutional arrangements that would be established under the BBNJ instrument. So the Conference of Parties, any scientific and technical body, for representatives of holders of traditional knowledge, especially indigenous peoples. And we've proposed language in the BBNJ instrument that makes sure to set aside, so to speak, or to open up these seats and spaces. And fifth, and definitely not least, we've highlighted the core importance of FPIC, of free, prior, and informed consent, along with all other relevant indigenous rights, particularly those that are reflected in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and ensuring that these rights must be at the center of all engagements between governments and holders of traditional knowledge, especially indigenous peoples. And we've proposed specific language in the BBNJ instrument, as you can see here in this slide, that treats the respect and the promotion and consideration of rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and the obligations thereto of states governments to be general principles, to be a general principle or approach. And in these proposals, the Pacific SIDS have been joined by Australia, New Zealand, and Norway. But throughout the negotiations, we have entered into some challenges in terms of possible engagement with indigenous peoples and local communities and their traditional knowledge, challenges that have been raised by other delegations, and I've highlighted a few here just to wrap up my presentation. One common refrain has been how to actually identify holders of traditional knowledge that are relevant to management decisions. How do state governments reach out to them? How do they involve them in the process? And so the Pacific SIDS and like-minded delegations have highlighted the importance of looking to best practices in other fora, such as in the UNFCCC with our own LCIPP, as well as the Indigenous Caucus, what's going on in the CBD, what's going on in IPBES, including what's going on in the Arctic, in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and the setup there. We've also highlighted the importance of respecting the right of indigenous peoples to self-identify as indigenous peoples, including through their own indigenous organizations or constituencies. We do not as state governments want to impose indigeneity on peoples. And of course, we champion FPIC in all forms and want to make sure that the opportunity for indigenous peoples in particular to engage in the BBNJ instrument is an opportunity that they are free to choose to utilize or to reject. We will never force any sort of engagement with indigenous peoples in particular. The other challenge has been how to sort of square traditional knowledge with best available scientific information. There are some delegations that question whether you can evaluate or consider traditional knowledge in the same manner as you would consider best available scientific information. And like I said earlier, we've tried to underscore that we respect and recognize indigenous systems for producing, validating, and applying traditional knowledge. We've also advocated for making sure that there are dedicated seats or spaces in the different institutional arrangements for the holders and experts of traditional knowledge to ensure, one, that there will be actual effective feedback from holders of such knowledge, and two, that such feedback would be evaluated in an appropriate manner. And a third sort of challenge that's come up recently is this notion that governments or libraries or repositories or other entities other than indigenous peoples and local communities should be considered as holders of traditional knowledge under the BBNJ instrument. One particular government has called itself a holder of traditional knowledge in this context. But the Pacific states have pushed back, saying that traditional knowledge, in our view, belongs to the indigenous peoples and local communities, who are the producers and implementers and maintainers of traditional knowledge. And so just to wrap up, with those principles in mind and with our efforts to keep on reinforcing them, we've managed to get nearly 24 references to traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities in all 4 elements of the current draft text of the BBNJ instrument, and it is now part of the group positions of nearly 150 states, including a large number of developed country delegations. And to this point, there is no sort of explicit wholesale rejection of traditional knowledge in the BBNJ negotiations. And so we are cautiously optimistic that with the guiding principles in mind for our engagement, that we will see this carry forward to the end of the text. So that's my engagement with the BBNJ negotiations, and it is my hope that maybe some of the lessons learned and the best practices that the Pacific states have engaged in those negotiations can be useful for the UNFCCC and for this webinar, especially for the consideration of governments, but also of holders of relevant traditional knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yo. That was illuminating as far as the activity taking place beyond national jurisdictions. Once again, we appreciate your ability to share with us this information through the recording. Cut. Normally, we take a little bit of time to do a bit of a summary of what has been presented, but because of time and to maximize the question and answer period, I'm going to forego that and hand the Q&A session over to Tom, and then we'll entertain questions. I would encourage interaction also between the presenters, and from that point on, we'll make a few final closing remarks and some announcements about the next webinar. But for the moment, please, Tom, take the time that's available for Q&A. I do want to note that the interpreters will likely go off at 1800 bond time, but I think that those who can still engage in English, if the Secretariat can let us know if we can continue for a few minutes beyond that, that would be great. But I'll hand it off to Tom now and wait for a chat response. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Daly. And I just want to start off by expressing my deep appreciation to our 3 speakers live here today. I really appreciated your comments, and I learned a lot personally. So I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your expertise. As Daly said, please, to the participants, submit questions through the question and answer function. I'm not seeing any at the moment, but I'd like to get it kicked off, and I certainly have a few questions myself that I'd like to pose to the panelists. So I'll start there, and if any of you would like to respond, I think just a simple wave is probably going to be the easiest way to go forward. So I kind of wanted to pick up on the thread that Anna kind of spoke to in her presentation about kind of participatory versus co-produced knowledge, and I think she spoke to it about, you know, the different levels of the kind of old models of scientific engagement that were more treating Indigenous peoples and their knowledge as objects of the study rather than genuine co-production. And I think also Jessica spoke to this as well on the need to have Indigenous leadership in the co-development of sustainable forestry, forest burning. So I would just like to hear a bit more about, as we're in this kind of a modern scientific epoch where there's a bit more recognition. Do you find that the lines of co-production of knowledge are still getting blurred? How often? And how can we make these distinctions more clearly? And building off that point, I'd also be curious to hear thoughts on, again, I think it was Anna who raised the example of how Arctic Indigenous peoples speak very differently about similar scientific concepts as non-Arctic academics. And in that same vein of making those lines of distinction more clear, how do you also build the bridges between groups who use different languages and words to get at the same scientific study? So those were kind of the two themes I wanted to pick up right off the bat. I'm not sure if anyone would like to speak to that. And I see, go ahead.
Yeah, Tom, I guess I'll start off. One of the things I wanted to mention, which I think is really important, and gets a little bit to the how, and it's in a point that Coeric made in their slides, but it gets to resources. One of the things that a lot of Indigenous communities struggle with is resources, not only, especially in the United States, nothing talks like money. And so some of our communities have set, if you're going to be speaking with an elder and taking their time, then you need to compensate them for their time. But different communities have different ideas as to what compensation is appropriate. And so when you're working with Indigenous communities, or when you first go into Indigenous communities, you need to spend the time. And I think that Alicia made a really good point about relationships. And I really, really enjoyed her training because relationships are so key. So it takes time, it takes resources of all different kinds, and you need to be, from the get-go, you need to start. Not all funding agencies, if you're talking directly funding, are going to be giving you resources to compensate local community. There's this idea in science that people should just be happy to talk to you. And that's just not appropriate in this forum, because certainly in the US system, with money comes power, which comes parity. And so if you're really going to have Indigenous partners working with you, they need to start with parity. Sometimes that includes having them as PIs, or principal investigators, on your proposals. A lot of times that includes you need to be compensated for their time. I really appreciated what Daly used, his name is Yao, but Clement Yao, when he was talking about all this participation of traditional knowledge holders, that participation is both time intensive and people need resources to be able to participate at that level. And one of the things that's beginning to change in the Arctic, which is great, certainly in Alaska, which is the area I'm most familiar with, is that because of the system of Native corporations, then more and more local people are being able to participate in these forums and have the resources to be able to do that. Whereas before, just a few decades ago, maybe two, you had one or two people you would see at all these meetings, and they would sort of become the experts in the knowledge holder, and that many of them were excellent at their job, but it became a full-time job for them that frequently they weren't compensated for. So that was one of the things, slightly off track from what you were talking about, but I think that's a really key component of everything we're talking about, is being able to have resources for local people, and access to resources brings parity to your presence with non-Indigenous scholars, which most of these conversations are still controlled by governments and non-Indigenous scholars. Some Indigenous scholars have risen into government positions, which is great, and and have gotten advanced conventional science degrees, but by and large, our traditional knowledge holders are not at that level, which leaves them with lack of parity and lack of equity.
Thank you, Anna. That's a really good point about compensation and the kind of commitment that's being asked of Indigenous peoples to engage with their knowledge. Jessica, I saw your hand up. Please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Anna. I think I think Anna covered it really well. I just wanted to use a little bit more of a definition around co-creativity and the use of reciprocity, like Anna was talking about. There's a lot of Indigenous groups that, for the love of their culture and for their want to be able to share their knowledge in a safe place, they participate in these sort of research programs, and they release this information on a freely loving manner. And a lot of the time that their knowledge is used, or parts of their knowledge is used, and it loses the essence of what they're wanting to share. And just to show one example, you can see here there is so many different elements in the use of identifying the indicators within the right timing to do cultural burning. And if we're using our elders' time and our knowledge holders' time to be able to share their knowledge, and I just wanted to make mention there that there is no legal term for the community-owned knowledge. And it's not until just 2 years ago that the Nudunjeri people in South Australia used a clause called Indigenous Ecological Knowledge, which allowed them to, in some cases, use the community to maintain their Indigenous ecological knowledge, because it is so important to climate change and supporting their cultural practices to maintain the integrity of what that practice does for the environment and its people and its nature that lives within inside it. But also in preventing poverty within our local Aboriginal communities, their engagement is quite important to have that reciprocity embedded in those practices. You know, as an example, one of our elders could work a 38-hour week, and then on their side, they are participating in sharing knowledge without any sort of reciprocity, and to the detriment sometimes of their current employment because of their love for sharing their culture. So those sort of things need to be taken into consideration when employing Aboriginal people in organisations, and that their need to be able to share Indigenous ecological knowledge is paramount to the support within their organisations that they're working. So that's another level of support that's needed for defining the co-creation of Indigenous ecological knowledge in co-production as well, and ethically and equitably being able to support that moving forward.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. There is one comment from Laura Lynn at the Resilience Institute. So hello, Laura. It's nice to see you here with us. Maybe I'll just flag that she's mentioning for the group that there is a project that her organization, the Resilience Institute, is working with 2 Indigenous communities to weave together Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge in weather monitoring. So if individuals are interested in that, I have Laura's contact information, and please feel free to reach out to me to discuss that further. But building on what you were just saying, Jessica, I did want to ask one more question, and going back to Yo's presentation where he presented on the 3 types of Indigenous knowledge that are being used for the purposes of the BBNJ in terms of connectivity, best practices, and traditional navigation, and kind of giving those almost a typology of what Indigenous knowledge is a useful input to the BBNJ. I'd just be curious to hear both yours and everyone else's views on if this is a helpful way to kind of conceptualize Indigenous knowledge, because I know there's generally a more holistic perspective, and the linkages and the multiple people in the community that are involved in developing Indigenous knowledge and holding that knowledge is it really appropriate for governments, academia to conceive of it in that more transactional sense of traditional navigation? And obviously it's a lot easier as policymakers and academics to understand it in that more, I guess, westernized language, but is it an appropriate kind of medium or a way to describe it? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, because I think it gets at that issue of language and language barriers and coming from different worlds. So if anyone would like to react to that, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Tom, I'll go ahead and it's not easy. I mean, co-production of knowledge is not easy. You're frequently coming from two completely different epistemologies and different worldviews, and not just language. Language is, in my viewpoint, the least of the issues, although we know a lot of conceptualization is embedded in language. And actually encourage people to take a look at some of Heather Gordon's work, because she's talking about trust. And, and we haven't, talked a whole lot about, at least I haven't talked a whole lot about ownership of knowledge and the issues that surround that. And when scientists, publish other people's knowledge, and property rights and how different Indigenous people conceptualize those things. But I think for co-production, it has to begin with power sharing and trust. And that takes time to build those relationships that Elisa was talking about, that are very embedded in her culture and are in most Indigenous people's way of envisioning and thinking about the world. But I think whether you're a governmental agency or whether you're a scientist or whether you're just a community member that's interested in certain things, you have to build that trust, and you have to listen a lot, which is what I said. White people are really bad at listening because we're trained from a very early age to pontificate and to talk. And we share knowledge by assuming that we know something from a fairly early age, and that's not the way other people are taught. So you have to kind of learn to shut up if you're the white scientist in the room, and do a lot more listening, which is super important. But I would begin with with that issue of relationships and trust and understanding, listening and believing. When a lot of white scientists go out on, walking on the tundra, and people start explaining how, reindeer give themselves to you, which is a common understanding in the North, that when you go hunting, the animal shows itself to you, it gives itself to you. It's a self-sacrificing so that your existence continues. There's this relationship between you and between the human being and animals, and that's common in a lot of traditions. And so there, Anne Reardon, who did the work with Chillista elders, wrote an article about how that was in contrast with the Alaska Fish and Game Department that set quotas on animals, and that you're only allowed to hunt so many animals, you get a license, blah, blah, blah. And yet Yupik people who believe and know, not just believe, that's kind of a very laden word, but know that if an animal shows itself to you and you don't take that animal, that's really insulting to the animal. And so, because governments and the colonial system, governments get to make the rules about hunting and fishing. But as Paul Natterjee was saying, what if we listened and saw the way Indigenous people talk about animals, and listen to what they were telling us, and see that as that is true, which he actually used that term, and we won't get into the whole philosophical discussion about what is truth, but that you can actually base management systems on that information. So if you're a scientist, listen to people and don't go, yeah, that's metaphysics, that's just a belief system, but actually acknowledge that what they're telling you has real world truth and consequences and understandings. I think that's an important piece. Younger scientists that I've worked with see this. They seem more open. More of them are more open, not all of them, than a lot of the older scientists. And I put myself in that group, even though I like to think that I've come along on this pathway, and many people in the Arctic have been very patient with me and teaching me. But I think that's really key. Trust, respect, understanding, and belief. I mean, belief is, again, as I say, is kind of a laden term, but this is true. What people are telling you is true. When an animal shows itself, it's self-sacrificing and it's insulting to the animal, not to hunt that animal. So think about those things. I think there is a pathway forward, but it's not easy. It's certainly not easy for conventionally trained scientists to think that pathway forward. But it needs to happen, because there's a whole realm of knowledge out there that the whole world can benefit from, which is what's wonderful about the Chillista volumes. That's what the UPIC believed. We're really smart people. We have a lot of knowledge. Everybody needs this knowledge. Not every Indigenous group. Some Indigenous groups have certain knowledge that if you share it, it becomes the power of the knowledge is lessened. So that has to be kept private and sacred. But other types of knowledge are really important for the whole world to know. And that was the viewpoint that the UPIC people took. Everybody needs this. All these scientists, all these white people, all these governors and policymakers, they need this knowledge, because this is really important. And indeed, they're right. They do need this knowledge.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I really appreciate those remarks and the challenge that is for policymakers and scientists. I understand that our interpreters have very kindly agreed to stay for another 10 minutes. So I do want to begin to wrap up. So I'd like to offer the opportunity to all our panelists to just say a last word, react to any comments raised. And Alicia, I saw you had your hand up, so please feel free to make your final remarks.
Sure. I just wanted to say, as sovereign entities, a lot of tribes and tribal communities are sovereign entities. So we have the ability to make our own laws and legislation, and we have areas that we govern. And so the Oglala Sioux tribe, we have a research review board. I was on that research review board before I became vice president. I had to get off because of the new position, but through that we saw all the research that all the research that came to our reservation and to our tribe had to go through our research review board. So that's another way. We talked about building capacity in our communities, and that's one of the pieces of capacity that we have so far that enables us to have those relationships, and also set our own parameters on how we protect human subjects, not only human subjects, but our land, our environments, and anything within our boundaries that's being studied and researched. So that is something that we have established through ordinance in our community, and that really does help us to create those relationships. And also we are the data that is collected is ours. So another piece of that is how do we store that data? How do we utilize that data once the researchers come in and create those relationships and collaborations moving forward? But that is another way that especially tribal communities that are sovereign can create communications with those other entities, because they do have to come through that research review board if they're going to do any type of research in our community. So just want to encourage those relationships to continue to build and and so that mutual collaboration. And the other part is having the Indigenous communities, like I said, we always tell our kids to go to school and come back and help your community, and then creating those positions for them to actually help their community, because the Indigenous researchers are the ones who are going to be able to make those connections really easy and much quicker, and connect the dots and adapt things for our communities so that they make sense, so they're relevant contextually and culturally. So I just want to thank Dr. Doro again for inviting me. Thank you and to the other panelists for your words and information, and I hope to continue these and help however I can with Dr. Doro.
Thanks, Alicia. Jessica or Anna, did you have any final words before I pass it over to Daly? I'm not seeing any, so oh, Jessica, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to express my sincere thanks to all that invited me on to talk about Indigenous ecological knowledge and the use of it within our Aboriginal communities here in Australia. I do want to have a final little discussion about the use of traditional ecological knowledge hubs. I know that the United Nations were looking at different models that were out there. I've researched some of the models that are out there, and the Newcastle University here in New South Wales is also looking into that as a way to support our Aboriginal communities to be prepared for the conversations around the use of their traditional knowledge, and to be able to store and share continuously for the life of that knowledge within the community. Also, just wanted to quickly mention the use of traditional knowledge and shared knowledge spaces that we've managed to be able to support our local traditional owners to be able to disseminate between the two spaces of shared knowledge, which is community-owned knowledge, which should be shared with the wider community, and the traditional practices that are held closer and have a bit of a more protection zone around them, so that those indicators and reflection of our traditional practices are supported. So being able to separate those two, one being the shared knowledge space and one being the traditional knowledge space, has allowed for another pathway for co-creation. Thank you all for supporting me to discuss these options and experiences that we've had with the Fire Sticks Alliance and our Indigenous communities. Alicia and Anna, it's been amazing hearing what you've had to say, and I really appreciate being able to be on this platform. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica. I think I saw that you didn't have any final remarks, Anna. So with that, I just want to thank our three panelists once again. I really appreciated your remarks, and turn it back over to Daly. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm so pleased about the technology working for us, but also, moreover, the substance shared by each of the presenters, and look forward to a future dialogue about this important issue. And at the outset, I forgot to mention that one of the benefits of this series of training workshops is that we put it together in order to inform state party members of the UNFCCC about the significance and the importance of Indigenous knowledge, that they're the target audience for these training webinars, because when one thinks about it, and as each of you has amplified, that Indigenous peoples are truly experts about the world around them, about their profound relationship with the environment. And too often we have seen the inequity, and each of you has spoken about the lack of parity between Western scientists and Indigenous knowledge holders. And so I think that this whole exercise has been critical for examining, as we entitle the program, the contours of Indigenous knowledge, not only its content, but its significance for Indigenous peoples. And one of the early webinars, I really appreciated the statement by a contributor that the health of the environment is intimately tied with the health of our people, and the health and sustainability of Indigenous knowledge, and how everything is interrelated. And these examples and lessons learned are really important as well. I want to say that along with what Jessica has noted here about these models or these hubs, that indeed through the facilitative working group, and one of the activities of the facilitative working group is to create a portal. But what has emerged is the strong message that in terms of a portal as to the activities of the facilitative working group and the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, that the rights of Indigenous peoples and the safeguarding of Indigenous knowledge is front and center in terms of this idea of a portal. Many, I think, especially state party representatives, believe that, okay, this is just a place where we can go and get Indigenous knowledge. But of course, that doesn't square at all with the fact that it's not a depository of Indigenous knowledge, but rather that Indigenous knowledge is a living and dynamic and vital part of the day-to-day lives of Indigenous peoples. And I greatly appreciated what Alicia said about the fact that they speak of Indigenous knowledge. They are expressing Indigenous knowledge in everything it is that they do. So the portal is there. The website will also feature the recordings of all of the webinars. I want to encourage each of you, as well as all of the participants that remain online and any others that you know of, to share what materials you might have in terms of your scholarly work, your protocols about the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge, any additional materials that are responsive to this particular activity of the facilitative working group. It also coincides with activity 3 of the facilitative working group, which is an effort to compile materials specifically related to Indigenous knowledge. I also want to point out that Yo obviously wasn't able to join us, but he would welcome any additional questions to him directly, and we can help to facilitate any questions that relate to the material that he presented that is intimately tied to this negotiation of a new treaty within the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea about biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. I think that I've covered everything except for the fact that the presenters aren't off the hook once the session ends, because what we would like to do is prepare a final written report based upon all of the training sessions. And in order to do this in collaboration with you, we'll prepare a draft report, but ensure that what you've shared is accurately reflected in the report. And if there's any need to add to or amplify a point or to correct anything, we're wide open to ensuring that everything that we finalize for purposes of this activity is true to the presenters and the Indigenous knowledge holders that we've been able to engage. So I greatly appreciate the time, especially given that 2, 3, 4 a.m. For Jessica, and look forward to future collaboration amongst you and the previous presenters, as well as the opportunity to ensure that we achieve a place in this world that does allow for genuine trust, respect, and recognition of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. So, Qianak, thank you so much for your time, energy, and intellect. And I believe this concludes our session. Anything further?
Maybe just quickly, Daly, just a reminder to the participants that are still there. The final webinar, which will look at opportunities moving forward, will be March 25th at the same time. So we hope to see you there. And a final thank you to our speakers, the interpreters who have been so generous with their time, as well as the participants, and of course the support of the Secretariat, and to you, Daly, for all your work in organizing this. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks to all. Bye.